Before we jump into this episode, I did want to make sure that you had heard about the new Energy Balance Solution group coaching program. I made an announcement about this recently, but that program is up and running, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about it, something that I'm really excited about. I've created this program because, for one, I've been entirely booked up with one-on-one clients, and my waitlist keeps growing, so I wanted to design a program that would allow you to get those same results as you would if we were doing one-on-one coaching, but also do so at a fraction of the price. And I've really gone out of my way to make sure that this program is affordable. And so I'm really excited about how the program's been going so far, and the results that people have been getting have just been phenomenal. So I'll tell you a little bit about what is included in the program. For one, there is a video library that includes videos geared toward helping you implement the bioenergetic approach with clear action tips and steps. And this includes videos on everything from restoring gut health to how you can lose weight without destroying your metabolism, or how you can boost your metabolism, how you can have amazing sleep, and tons more. There's a ton of videos in there, and I'm continuing to add videos to that library every month. There's also a bunch of resources included in the program, like a sample meal plan, a food guide, a calorie and macronutrient cheat sheet, and more. There's also a private community where you can get support between the group coaching calls, both for me and everyone else in the program. And then a major feature of this program, of course, being that you get 2 monthly small group coaching calls so that you can get personalized help. And I'm keeping these coaching calls small so that everyone has time to ask questions and get help just like they would if they were talking to me one-on-one. So to find out more about this program, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/solution. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce this episode. So welcome to episode 89 of the Energy Balance Podcast, where we teach you how to live without constant hunger and cravings, fatigue, brain fog, poor sleep, and other low energy symptoms by maximizing your cellular energy. I'm Jay Feldman. I'm a health coach and independent health researcher. And joining me again today is my good friend, Mike Fave. Mike and I have been studying health and nutrition together for a long time now, and Mike also draws on his experiences from working within the healthcare industry. Today's episode will include a discussion about 2 studies discussing a couple of different things. The first one focusing on the effects of different fatty acids on hormones and inflammatory markers. And then the other study will be going over the effects of fruit juice on blood sugar regulation and various inflammatory markers. And so more specifically, we'll be talking about whether polyunsaturated fats cause more oxidative stress than saturated fats. We'll be talking about how PUFA intake affects testosterone. We'll be discussing whether fruit juice should be avoided for blood sugar regulation. We'll also discuss the effects of fruit juice on inflammatory markers and endotoxin, and whether fruit juice has the same effects as soda. As I mentioned in the previous episode, this is a continuation of a different format of episodes where we walk through a couple of different studies and evaluate their claims and talk through the results and make some extrapolations based on the information. So let us know what you think about this style of episode in the comments, or you can send me an email to jay@jfeldmanwellness.com and let us know if you'd like us to continue peppering in episodes like these. If you're new to this podcast, then after listening through today's episode, I'd highly recommend you go back and listen to episodes 1 through 7, where we took some time to build a foundation as far as the bioenergetic view of health goes. And to check out the show notes for today's episode, you can head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/podcast, where you can take a look at the studies and articles and anything else that we referenced throughout this episode. And with that, let's get started.
So the next one, I guess that we'll do is showing. So we've talked about. So now we have a compound from foods that's affecting the hormonal profile and the cell structure, which, according to that previous study that we talked about last week, those authors are saying it's nothing to do with foods. It's everything to do with you. People just need to exercise more. Which this is clear evidence that, at least in rats, that is, or in mammals, and some mammals, that's not the case. It's not just down to exercise. We have an effect from food that is showing inside the tissue structure. So now we're going to further that with another study that is showing that just lipids itself modifies the tissue structure and the function of that tissue, which again, now we don't even need some special phytoestrogen. This is literally just the lipid itself. So this study is, and we can go through this one a little bit quicker. It's more graphs to look at than anything, but dietary lipids modify the redox, the oxidation reduction. That's what redox is. Homeostasis and steroidogenic status in rat testes. And so essentially what they did here, they had a series of female rats. They were bred and maintained on a controlled diet through gestation and lactation. The female rats were housed individually and kept at these temperatures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then they basically had the pups. After weaning, the 40 male pups were randomized to one of 4 groups of 10 animals each and fed an ad libitum on one of 4 different diets. Diets were prepared in an identical manner except for the lipid source added as commercial oil. So one lipid source was soybean oil, one was olive oil, one was coconut oil, one was grapeseed oil. That was at 70 grams per kilogram of diet. The final fatty acid composition of each diet is presented in Table 2. Rats were fed according to the American Institute of Nutrition. So basically the rats were eating all the same diet. Here's the diet over here if anyone's interested. Basic casein, sucrose, cornstarch, cellulose, the commercial oils here. And then minerals, basically minerals and vitamins afterwards. Now, what we're going to get to is what we're really looking here to see is what's the difference between coconut oil, soybean oil, grapeseed oil, and olive oil on testicular structure and then on the testicular function. And so we have some graphs over here, or not graphs, excuse me. We have a table over here. And so what it's showing is the fatty acid composition of the diet. So the basically what the fatty acids look like. So you have the soybean diet, the soybean oil diet, olive oil diet, coconut oil diet, and grapeseed oil diet. I'm not going to go through all the individual fatty acids here. The important here is going to be looking at the change between them of saturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, and PUFA. The saturated fatty acids are obviously highest in the coconut oil group here at 94.6. I don't know what unit they're having it as changed, so I don't know what the units are. Let's see. Results are represented as mole percentage. So this is percentage. So it's 94.6% saturated fatty acids here in the coconut oil, 4% monounsaturated fatty acids, 1.3% PUFA. And the olive oil group are 20% saturated, 70% MUFA, 8.4% PUFA. On the soy, we're 28% saturated fatty acids, 9% MUFA, and 62% PUFA. And the grapeseed is close to the soy at 17.6% saturated, 17% MUFA, and 65.5% PUFA. So the soy and grapeseed are mostly PUFA. The one thing we'll look at here is 18.2. So the grapeseed group had much higher linoleic acid than the soy, about 10% more. So 65.1% in the grapeseed and 55.1% in the soy. And then the soy group had higher omega-3, it looks like alpha linoleic acid. I think this is it right here, at 6.8% compared to 0.1% in the grapeseed. So 6.8% in soy and 0.1% in the grapeseed. The reason this is important and why they use the two different oils is because they're going to make arguments about omega-3 to omega-6 ratio and things like that. Just wanted to point that one out. So when we get down here, we have changes in body weight and the testicular weight in the different groups. So the body weights were, they wound up being largest in the coconut oil and then second largest in the soy. You could, if anybody, then the olive oil was third largest and then the grapeseed oil weighed the least. So the coconut oil gained the most body weight, then the soy, then olive, then grapeseed. What I want to talk about here. So when we get to the absolute testicular weight, the olive oil and coconut oil had the highest testicular weights, whereas the soy and grapeseed had the least. The relative testicular weight was highest in olive oil, then in coconut oil, and then soy and grapeseed were less than both the olive oil and coconut oil. Now, this is not as important as some of the other stuff that we're getting to below, but we're seeing that the the testicular weights are highest in olive oil and coconut oil, which is, I think, what we would kind of expect. But again, how is that happening and why is that happening? And I don't know if you want to jump in here on any of this, Jay.
No, not yet. I think it's all pretty self-explanatory so far.
Yep. So now what we want to see is what is the effect of the diet on the fatty acid composition of the testicular phospholipids. So what we're seeing here is in the coconut oil group, we had a massive increase in saturated fatty acids, about 64.6% saturated fatty acids, 5.9% monounsaturated, and then 29.1% polyunsaturated. Something to keep in mind that's important is inside the phospholipids, there's a conserved amount of polyunsaturated fat. So you're not going to be able to necessarily get it to zero, even if you're having all this coconut oil. The body still maintains some polyunsaturated. And the phospholipids, just so everybody knows, are the little lipids that use to make the cell membranes and whatnot. So there's always going to be a little bit of PUFA in those, regardless of how much saturated fatty acid intake you're going to have. And I think AJ Holbert is somebody who talks about some of these mechanisms as the effects of different fatty acids on phospholipid and membrane fatty acid composition overall. But there's some conservation of PUFA inside them.
Yeah, and to largely varying effects varying amounts depending on the species. So there are, again, talking about species differences that I kind of alluded to in the last episode, or the last study we were going through. There are some, and so that is one of them, kind of that more or less set point or certain amounts, certain fatty acid compositions of those phospholipid membranes that don't, or, that only varies so much. Another huge factor is the length of time on the diet, what diet they were on before. So maybe if this was carried out for longer, we would see a further decrease in polyunsaturated fats with the coconut oil group, for example. But yeah, there's several parameters to, that would have to be considered.
Yeah. And overall, what you're really seeing here is that coconut oil had the least PUFA on the membrane. Olive oil had the second least, although there was a pretty big difference. And then soybean oil and grapeseed oil had the most. But olive oil was kind of close to them. And this is just in the phospholipids. When we get down here, we're going to see of the neutral lipids. You'll see some more change, but what you're going to see the lipid changes in the testicles, but then we're also going to see some changes in peroxidation, which is important. So when we get down to, and then we're going to also see hormonal changes. So we're going to get to see a series of changes altogether. When we get down to neutral lipids, so these aren't necessarily phospholipids. These are other lipids inside the testicles, inside the cells. Again, coconut oil had the most saturated, least PUFA. Then we had olive oil wound up having a little bit more PUFA than the soybean oil group, which is actually quite interesting. Inside the testicles had neutral lipids, and then grapeseed had the most PUFA overall, although the difference was 1% here. So olive oil was 30 and soybean oil was 29. But coconut oil, again, came in at the lowest at 26% PUFA, and their saturated fats were higher. Monounsaturated was lower. Now, when we get into the, not there. When we get, this is what I want us to get to.
Just real quick, if you don't mind, Mike.
Yeah.
You're talking about the difference between, so two things I want to mention. One is that when we're just so people understand the phospholipid versus the neutral lipids, the phospholipid is what is considered to be in the membrane of the cell structure, the mitochondria, the membranes, like the outer parts. The way that I would think of it from a view that doesn't necessarily include membranes is just that these are the structural fats. Whereas the neutral ones are the ones that might be used for fuel, precursors to, various other metabolites, things like that, that could just be stored as triglycerides. So that's the difference there. And it's interesting to see that there's a larger difference in this phospholipid polyunsaturated fat versus saturated fat in the coconut oil group versus the neutral lipids, basically showing that the physiology is favoring a reduction in unsaturation of the phospholipids more than otherwise. So,
yep.
And again, you're going to get into lipid peroxidation in a bit, which is basically a huge reason for that, which is that the composition of the cellular structure, the cellular membrane, if you want to think of it in that way, matters a lot. And we talked about this in our original PUFA episode way early on in the podcast. I'll link to that. It's something we've talked about a lot, about how much that composition matters for energy production, for the ability for the cell to get damaged, and on from there. It's basically one of the things we also talked about in terms of lifespan and aging, because the more unsaturated those membranes, I'm saying in quotes, are, the quicker you age, the shorter your lifespan. So it's a huge factor, and we're seeing that the physiology here is favoring the saturation of those membranes over the saturation of the neutral lipids. So more saturated structure there, the physiology is dictating matters more than these neutral lipids. So just an interesting side note there.
Yeah. And what we're going to get into, this is just talking about, so the total lipids when we get into here were highest in the coconut oil group overall. And then after that, you had the olive oil group and then the soybean and grapeseed. This is actually slightly interesting to me, just because my thought process on that is, if you have more saturated fats present, then the idea would be that you could probably pack more fats into the same amount of space, because the saturated fats tails aren't bent because they don't have the double bonds. Not just a random thought that occurred, but perhaps that is a reason why you're seeing the increase in lipids inside the cell, because you can put more lipids in a smaller amount of space. Saturated fats are much more dense. That's why you have a more solid structure at different temperatures than you would for the unsaturated fats, which are liquid at lower temperatures. It's a change in density. So that's just something interesting there. Not too much really to go into here. To break it down, they're seeing they're just breaking through the amount of fats or cholesterol, etc. inside the cell. The other thing to point out is, perhaps if you are having more lipid peroxidation inside those cells, then you wouldn't be able to house as much lipids there as well. There has to be cleanup. Like, for example, and lipids isn't just fatty acid tails. You have phospholipids, neutral lipids, triglycerides, cholesterol, esterified cholesterol, and plasmalogens, which are, all these are classes of lipids. So I'm not going to really cover this piece right here, but
one interesting point, just really quick in that table, is that the coconut oil group has an increase in cholesterol. Free cholesterol, and esterified is very similar. Yeah. Even though there's no cholesterol in coconut oil, there's no change in dietary cholesterol there. Of course, we have talked about why dietary cholesterol is not the only factor that is going to affect your blood levels of cholesterol or your tissue levels of cholesterol. But yeah, just interesting to point that out.
It may be able to have more cholesterol, because as we get below, there's less oxidative damage and increased amount of antioxidants.
Right, and also maybe for steroidogenesis, there's an increase in cholesterol delivery to the tissues, and on from there.
The other thing that's interesting is, in the olive oil and coconut oil groups, which are lower in PUFA, there's actually a decreased amount of esterified cholesterol with an increased amount of free cholesterol. Mm-hmm. And I think Dr. Pete has discussed the problems with esterified cholesterol over free. Yeah. So that's something that's quite interesting as well. Esterified cholesterol possibly being esterified, perhaps because of damage or as a protective mechanism against oxidation, something along those lines.
Right. Yeah.
So what we really get to over here, and so these are the tables that I think everyone's going to want to know, is antioxidant status in the testicles, and then also hormone levels. So in the coconut oil and olive oil group, so the coconut oil had the lowest amount of T-bars. So T-bars are markers of lipid peroxidation, and I think it's thiobarbiturate reactive oxygen species, or reactive species. So coconut oil came in at the lowest, is obviously the lowest amount of PUFA. Olive oil second lowest. Then there was soybean oil and grapeseed oil, which had significantly higher T-bars than the coconut oil and the olive oil. Almost 3 times as much lipid peroxidation in the grapeseed oil group than the coconut, and almost 2 times as much in the grapeseed oil as the olive oil. About 2 times as much peroxidation in the soybean oil versus the olive oil and the coconut oil. Again, so all of these, there's the conjugated dienes, fragmented DNA, the ROOH. Let me see if they tell us. These are just reactive oxygen species as well. And then the FRAP is another. All of these are measures of lipid peroxidation, and then also protein oxidation and DNA damage. So basically what we're seeing is the lowest amount of oxidation inside coconut oil and olive oil. And then the lowest amount of DNA damage inside coconut oil and olive oil, and the lowest amount of protein carbonylation, which is a marker of protein damage, usually from oxidative stress inside the coconut oil and olive oil compared to the grapeseed oil and the soybean oil. So overall, the coconut oil and the olive oil had the least amount of reactive oxygen species and lipid damage, which is the T-bars, ROHs, and then the conjugated diene. So that's all looking at lipids. And then fragmented DNA was lowest in those groups as well, which is looking at DNA damage. And then the FRAP assay is ferric reducing ability of plasma. So that's looking at the ability of the plasma to handle iron. And it's an indication of ability to manage oxidative stress. So that's actually highest inside coconut oil and olive oil, which is good. You want a higher number. And then the protein carbonyls, again, lowest in coconut oil and olive oil. So obviously coconut oil and olive oil are having the least amount of oxidative stress. You want to touch on any of those, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear with oxidative stress. I like that they're also showing that not only is this oxidation and damage to the lipids themselves, but also the DNA and the protein. So I think you mentioned this, but for the DNA, we're seeing 2 to 3 times as much damage in the higher PUFA groups. And in the protein, you're seeing 3 to 4 times as much damage. And, in the high PUFA groups compared to the very low PUFA groups. And, when it comes to things like ages, for example, which are advanced glycation end products, where you're seeing the glycation of proteins that basically damage the proteins, people tend to blame it on sugar, but as is being demonstrated here, the fat composition has a huge effect, and that's something that Ray's discussed, is that the composition of the fat and consuming PUFA has way larger of an effect on ages than sugar does, and Chris Masterjohn has corroborated that as well, so I'll link to an article where he shows that.
So besides the DNA damage, the protein damage, the lipid peroxidation, which was higher in coconut oil, or not coconut oil, excuse me, the soybean oil and grapeseed oil, we also looking at antioxidant levels. So there's a sorbate here, which is vitamin C. Highest levels were in olive oil, actually, but then also coconut oil, and the lowest levels were in soybean oil and grapeseed oil. Mm-hmm. Alpha tocopherol was highest in coconut oil and olive oil, but lowest in the soybean oil. And then grapeseed oil actually was doing better than the soybean oil. I think the reason this slightly, but I think the reason that may be is because the soybean oil had more omega-3s. So you're actually seeing less tocopherol in that group because the tocopherol is being used by the omega-3s. And the reason you may be seeing more sorbate in the olive oil group versus the coconut oil group is perhaps some of the polyphenols in the olive oil were protective, but the sorbate is usually for water-based oxidation, whereas the vitamin E is for lipid-based oxidation. And the coconut oil being more saturated had most likely had less oxidation than the other groups because it had minimal amounts of PUFA. And the olive oil had a little bit more PUFA. But the difference between the olive oil and the coconut oil group, as far as alpha tocopherol and also vitamin E, was relatively minimal. Whereas the differences in alpha tocopherol levels between olive oil and coconut oil versus grapeseed oil and soybean oil was like multiple times, like 2 times difference to 2 to 3 times difference, which is actually quite a big difference. There was 2 to 3 times more alpha tocopherol in the olive oil and the coconut oil groups than the grapeseed oil and the soybean oil. And that matches perfectly with the lipid peroxidation we saw above, where there was multiple times more lipid peroxidation in the soybean oil and grapeseed oil group than there was in the olive oil and coconut oil group. And then protein thiols, which are, again, I think that's kind of like, what is it? It's like alpha lipoic acid, I think, is part of the thiol system. And I think it's measures of the ability to protect protein from damage. I'm not 100% sure on this one.
Yeah, I'm not either, outside of them just being an aspect of an antioxidant system.
But I know the thiol system involves the alpha lipoic acid system. And I think they're looking at perhaps protein thiol, maybe the amount of them here. It seems like there's higher amounts in olive oil and coconut oil. I couldn't actively interpret this one appropriately right now. But what I can interpret is the glutathione, the reduced versus oxidized amount, the ratio. Let's see. So it's reduced glutathione to oxidized glutathione. So the ratio is significantly multiple times better, like many times better in the olive oil and coconut oil groups than the soybean oil and grapeseed oil group. What is it? Almost from olive oil to soybean oil, you're almost, it's like 50 to 200. So you're almost four times better glutathione content in the olive oil group than the soybean oil group, and about the same, or actually no, even more.
Grapeseed's like 6 times. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the coconut oil group is 4 times to the grapeseed, and then 3 times to the soy, about 3 times to the soy.
Yeah. Yeah. Huge differences there.
Way more glutathione in olive oil and coconut oil groups, way more vitamin C, way more alpha tocopherol, decreased protein damage, decreased DNA damage, decreased lipid peroxidation compared to the soy and grapeseed. So I think we have a clear indicator here. But the next question is, and if you want to jump in, jump in. The next question is, what is that doing to our hormones? What does that do to the hormone production?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to jump in on was, again, just connecting this back to the time frame and hormesis, where a lot of the things that will cause damage will at some point cause a rebound antioxidant increase as a result of the oxidative damage. Obviously, we're not seeing that here, where we're seeing that the groups that had the more oxidative damage had lower levels of antioxidants, and it would depend on when exactly they're testing it, after how long, but there tends to also be a point where you see an increase in those things, and that's why some people will cite things that are damaging as positive, hormetic factors, but that's that it's generally not actually accurate. Again, it depends on the time frame.
Yeah. And the other thing that's important to show here is that just changing the lipids in your diet alters the structure and other important variables like oxidation and reduction, which is extremely important inside your tissues, which is, and something to keep in mind is, if your tissue, the machine comparison isn't perfect, but it works here, even with a calories in, calories out machine model, right? Where the body's just a machine, you put in calories, it burns them and puts them out. If your furnace is building up a ton of, I don't know, when they burn coal, they produce creosote and other compounds that were toxic. If you're building up a whole bunch of toxic compounds while you're burning your fuel, then you can cause damage to the furnace. In this situation, when you have better fuel sources, then you have more protection of the furnace, and you have less damage to the furnace overall. It's not a perfect example, but again, this flies in the face of the generally understood ideas around calories in, calories out, and what these researchers are saying in the previous study that Jay and I talked about last week, where essentially, you just need to make sure that your fuel stores aren't too topped off by doing some exercise, so that you can have flux through these retaining areas, which was the muscles and the liver and the adipose tissue. And if they're not full, then you won't gain weight, you won't whatever things they were trying to discuss. And it's like, well, there's more to the picture, because not only if you're eating too much, if you're eating an excessive amount of soy and you're altering and you have BPA on board, or you have higher amounts of estrogen in your system, your metabolism is going to be disturbed as far as producing adequate androgens. That'll change your lean mass and your fat mass. But here also, if you're eating the wrong fats, you may not, and we'll get to it, you may not be producing adequate androgens, but also you'll have increased oxidative stress inside the testicles that'll decrease how well they're working, and then also eliminate their antioxidants, or increase the amount of antioxidants that you need to have in the diet, and change the redox status. And then also, besides changing the redox status, cause more DNA damage if you have excess amounts of these polyunsaturated fatty acids, and then also damage the proteins and the fatty acids inside the cellular structure. So you're literally damaging the structure itself. If the structure is being damaged, is it going to be able to produce adequate amount of energy? From the hypothesis that we work with Ray, which is energy and structure are interdependent at every level. If you start damaging the structure, well, do you think the energy is going to be able to flow as well? Most likely not. Especially you're seeing protein damage, DNA damage, and lipid damage. And the lipid damages could be at the membranes for the mitochondria, and we've gone into that before. I'm not gonna go through that whole cycle again. Do you want to add anything there, Jay?
No, let's see the effects on the hormones, which, as you were kind of getting at, is obviously has an effect on body composition and among, as we talked about, every other aspect of health.
Yep. So here we have hormones. We have olive oil and coconut oil. Now, first things we're going to notice is that the LH and FSH inside the coconut oil groups are lower. This isn't actually a bad thing. Those are the hormones that signal to the testes to produce more hormones and to develop more sperm. So they're actually lower here, and we'll get to it in a second. And then what they have over here is we'll look at the total testosterone first, and then we'll go to the estradiol and then free testosterone to bound testosterone. But the total testosterone was significantly higher in the olive oil and the coconut oil groups. The coconut oil was the highest, almost twice as much testosterone in the coconut oil group versus the grapeseed oil group, and almost 1.5 times as much testosterone in the coconut oil group compared to the soybean oil group. Olive oil lags a little bit behind coconut oil, but not by too much. So you're seeing decreased LH and FSH, which are the signaling hormones to produce testosterone and develop sperm, but you're seeing more testosterone in the coconut oil and olive oil groups. It means things are working better. You don't need that pituitary signal to produce more testosterone because the testicles are able to produce it effectively. Whereas in the soybean oil and the grapeseed oil groups, you have almost twice as much, to 1.5 to 2 times as much FSH and LH as compared to the olive oil and coconut oil groups, and their testosterone levels are still lower. So they're having an increased pituitary signal to produce testosterone with a decreased testosterone output in the grapeseed oil and the soybean oil group, whereas in the coconut oil and the olive oil group, you're having a decreased testosterone output with an increased testosterone output, with a decreased requirement for pituitary signaling, which is great. Those are all great signs here overall. The next thing we could talk about here is the estradiol. Now, the estrogen is a little bit higher in the olive oil and coconut oil groups than it is in the soybean oil and the grapeseed oil group. I think that's just because they're having a higher amount of testosterone overall. And the pattern tracks that because you have the testosterone is highest in the coconut oil group and the olive oil groups, and you see the estrogen are higher there. Then the soybean oil group has more testosterone than the grapeseed oil group, and it has some more estrogen than the grapeseed oil group does. And with the grapeseed oil group, it has the lowest testosterone and also the lowest estrogen. So I think the testosterone and estrogen are kind of balancing between each other here based on the the more testosterone you have, kind of the more estrogen they're getting. It looks like there's perhaps a ratio that the rat's tissues are keeping. There's always going to be aromatization. So I don't think that that's necessarily so worrisome here. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, I mean, maybe also a factor of the increased weight gain. I don't think they delineated between muscle mass and fat mass, but if there was an increase in body fat, that could have been a factor as well, increasing aromatization.
Yep.
Go ahead. So I wanted to mention, as far as LH and FSH goes, just a comparison for people that might make it easier to understand, is TSH, which is basically another stimulating hormone that's produced by the pituitary when there's not enough thyroid activity being sensed.
Well, the other thing too is you have more activity in the olive oil and coconut oil group because they looked at free testosterone and bound testosterone. So free testosterone was highest in coconut oil, second highest in olive oil. The coconut oil group was almost 2 times higher than the grapeseed oil group. But then also the bound testosterone was relatively similar, highest in the coconut oil, second highest in the olive oil, and then obviously soy, and then grapeseed, then soy. So you have a higher free testosterone in olive oil and coconut oil with a higher bound testosterone. And then they look at the free to bound ratio. The free to bound ratio was highest in olive oil, second highest in coconut oil, and then soy, and then grapeseed. So they have the higher olive oil and coconut oil have a higher free testosterone to bound testosterone ratio, higher free testosterone and higher bound testosterone, and higher total testosterone than the soybean oil and the grapeseed oil group. So they have more hormone overall and more activity and decreased pituitary signaling. The other thing I wanted to put in here is these are enzymatic activities in the different groups. So there's this 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase and 17-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. The 3-beta is catalyzes the conversion of progesterone from pregnenolone. Basically, it's the conversion of pregnenolone forward, and then the 17 beta I think is directly, I have here the conversion of DHEA, androstenediol into testosterone and estrogen. So what you're seeing is that the enzyme activities are much higher, almost 3 times higher in the olive oil group than the grapeseed group, and almost 2.5 times higher in the coconut oil compared to the grapeseed, and then about 2 times higher from the olive oil to the soybean oil, and about 1.5 times higher from the coconut oil to the soybean oil. These enzymatic activities are higher in the olive oil group and the coconut oil group than the soybean oil and the grapeseed oil group. So we have, just to recap, we have higher testosterone, we have higher free testosterone, we have higher bound testosterone, we have lower FSH and LH, we have increased vitamin C, increased vitamin E, increased glutathione, and decreased lipid peroxidation, DNA damage. What was the other ones? Protein damage. All of that is inside the coconut oil and the olive oil groups compared to the soybean oil and the grapeseed oil groups. So you have a whole litany of changes that are indicating all quite beneficial effects from the coconut oil and olive oil compared to the soybean oil and the grapeseed oil, which all have we're seeing direct hormonal effects. There's going to be direct metabolic effects as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that pretty much, I mean, there's some other stuff I highlighted down here, and it's just talking about linoleic acid and et cetera, but we cover a lot of this stuff overall. There's one little point here that's talking about plasmalogens. That was interesting. They have antioxidant properties themselves with the fatty acids, and the plasmalogens were highest, obviously, in coconut oil and the coconut oil and the olive oil groups. And then over here, they're just talking about vitamin E being a antioxidant, and it stabilizes PUFA-enriched membranes. It downregulates superoxide generation, and then that is increasing the testicular steroidogenesis reduced by inhibition of antioxidant enzymes due to excessive nitric oxide formation. So that any excess reactive oxygen species or oxidative stress in the cell can reduce enzyme function, and that's what we were seeing essentially. We saw reduced enzyme function in the grapeseed oil and the soybean oil. So if anything, the coconut oil and olive oil groups are where we should be, and then the grapeseed oil and the soybean oil groups are the aberration. So they're dropping it from what normal should be.
Right, exactly. And we've referenced some studies before where if there is PUFA, given the presence of PUFA or the dietary enrichment with PUFA will increase oxidative stress in the testicles, and that vitamin E will help to rescue that. So here they're not adding in any vitamin E. They're showing that the vitamin E is decreased from the PUFA, but we've also referenced studies in the past showing that the vitamin E can actually oppose this effect, exactly how they described here.
Yep. Yeah. So this is let me stop the share here. That was our second study. So now what we've seen is the certain compounds in food, like phytoestrogens from soy, can be damaging to your testicular structure, alter hormonal profile, perhaps in a negative way, change fertility. All of these things will have effects on the physiology in general. And now we're seeing that different fatty acids have different effects on the physiology in general on multiple levels. So the next piece is there are beneficial compounds in food that can change different responses. So we'll go into a whole host of different responses, microbiome responses, and also insulin and glucose handling. Now, we've discussed this study before in the last podcast, and it's a pretty famous study in the bioenergetic sphere. So I'm going to share it, and we'll jump into it. So this one's famous in the bioenergetic sphere. It's orange juice neutralizes pro-inflammatory effect of a high-fat, high-carbohydrate meal and prevents endotoxin increase in toll-like receptor expression. I'm not going to read all of these in the interest of time, but what I do want to get to is what exactly they did And then we're going to see changes. The changes I want to highlight here are microbiome changes, inflammatory changes, and blood sugar handling changes. And this is just from orange juice. And the purpose of doing all three of these studies, so just to reiterate for everyone here, is that we want to show that there's other effects from each individual food that flies in the face of this idea of it's just calories in, calories out, or if it fits your macros or something ridiculous like that. We're having individual effects of all these different foods, and it's quite important. And we're not even talking about nutritional differences as far as micros. If it fits your macros, well, are you covering all your micros? So there's that argument. I feel like is basic. It should just be understood.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and of course, this all pertains to body composition, which is normally what people are referring to when they're talking about if it fits your macros or calories in, calories out. But these things also just have as much relevance to general health, gut health, immune health, reproductive health, and on from there, brain health, as heart health, all the things we talk about all the time. It has just as much relevance to those things as it does body composition.
Yep. So what they did here is 3 groups of 10 healthy normal weight men and women. They have an age range 20 to 25, or BMI is 20 to 25, age range is 20 to 40. They gave them 3 groups ingested a 300 kilocalorie drink of 75 grams of glucose, or they did orange juice or water alone. So the comparison is orange juice, just pure glucose or water. And then they had that with a 900 kilocalorie high-fat, high-carbohydrate meal, which was egg muffin, sausage muffin sandwiches, and 2 hash brown potatoes. Contained 81 grams of carbs, 51 grams of fat, and 32 grams of protein. That is a lot of fat for one meal. That's definitely for sure. I don't know what fat they used, but I doubt it was, coconut oil, hash browns, or anything like that. Probably right. Some type of vegetable oil. So we already have problems there, but that's not the point. You're still going to see differences. To compensate for the difference in volume between the drinks, subjects were asked to drink an extra 350 milliliters of water with the glucose drink. And then all subjects were given 10 to 15 minutes to finish their drinks and meals. That was tight. 10 to 15 minutes to eat 1,000 calorie meal with, oh boy.
Yeah, they're really setting these people up for a rough time. As you said, between a huge PUFA laden meal, as they said, high carb, high fat meal. Not that is necessarily a problem, but they're talking very high fat here, which can be an issue for some people. I mean, I don't think it's even so concerning, but when it's high PUFA, definitely. Not to mention all the other issues with I'm sure the muffins and whatever's in the sausage.
Yeah.
And then, as you said, not only do they have to finish the meal in 10 to 15 minutes, but they also have to drink 700 milliliters.
No, 350 milliliters with an extra 75 grams of carbohydrate.
I thought it was because they said an extra 350 with the glucose drink.
Oh, okay. Yeah, perhaps it's.
I guess it doesn't say how much volume of liquid it is in total.
Either way, they still had to drink a decent amount of. Had to drink a decent amount of fluid and eat this fat meal in 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah, which those things alone is not a good recipe. Definitely something that would drive some inflammatory responses. So it makes the protective effect that we'll be getting into of orange juice even more notable.
Yep. And then they looked at a whole bunch of like ROS, mononuclear cells, which are immune cells. They looked at different like markers in the immune cells, like TLR4, TLR2, toll-like receptor 2 and 4. Both of those are inflammatory markers. They looked at SOCS3, which is a marker involved in insulin resistance. And then those are the main 3 we're going to cover. The other ones are in there, but those are the main ones to focus on. Again, TLR4, TLR2. And then they looked at the endotoxin content in the plasma. They also looked at it in the food, which is kind of cool too, but it's kind of useless because the amounts in the foods were so small that it's not going to make a difference on plasma levels. So what we have here is plasma glucose concentrations and of the 3 different meals, and here's the hours following the challenge. So the area under the curve is usually about a 3-hour type of deal. And what we're going to see here is quite interesting. So the black triangle is the orange juice plus the meal. And just what I want to note off the bat for this black triangle is we look at the plasma glucose concentrations here. It didn't spike the blood glucose that much at all with the orange juice. Whereas with the glucose meal, you have quite the spike. Not really that much, but in comparison to the orange juice, not that much at all. And then with the water meal, you have a minimal spike at most. So there's something with the orange juice that seems to be improving glucose handling in the body, or insulin sensitivity, essentially. And when we come down here, when you look at plasma insulin concentrations, we do see at the black triangle in the center here that the orange juice meal did increase insulin. It just didn't increase it as much as the glucose meal. And then obviously water didn't increase insulin the least because it didn't have the extra 75 grams of carbohydrate. They just had the potatoes and whatever the bread was. So what you're seeing based on these two graphs alone, the orange juice is raising insulin, but it's not drastically increasing blood sugar. So what you can surmise or what you can assume here based on these results alone, or I guess it wouldn't be an assumption, it would kind of be a hypothesis, that the orange juice is increasing the body's insulin sensitivity, so less insulin was needed to have the body respond to more carbohydrate, which is quite an amazing response here overall, just looking at insulin sensitivity alone. So that's another thing. It's not just calories in, calories out. Are your calories coming from a glucose drink? Are you drinking a Gatorade, or are you drinking an orange juice? Because if you're drinking an orange juice, based on what we can see here, we can assume that there's some improvements in your insulin sensitivity with the orange juice versus the Gatorade. Not to mention, the other thing to point out here as well is that the orange juice, it does have something else to consider. This is a glucose compared to a sucrose with glucose and fructose. So you may not see as much of a spike as well because the orange juice does also contain fructose, which doesn't necessarily spike blood sugar to the same extent that glucose does or have such a potent insulinogenic response. But overall, these two curves would indicate a degree of increased insulin sensitivity because you have decreasing insulin with a more managed blood sugar, which is, what everyone wants. I don't know if you want to add anything to this.
I just wanted to say that the blood glucose responses seem pretty low considering a meal that already had 80 grams of carbs plus 75 grams from the drinks.
But it could be because of the large amount of fat.
Yeah, or I was thinking they're probably fasted going into this.
That's true.
I just wanted to mention that that's probably a reason for the minimal blood sugar raising effects in the first place. And if they weren't fasted, we'd probably see an even larger difference between the meals.
Yeah, I think they were fasted up here. Let's see.
Overnight fast. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So either way, just a nice difference that you could see here compared to and the one thing I want to point out is why are we seeing more insulin in the OJ versus the water? I think because you would be having less carbohydrate because they didn't add the 75 grams of carbohydrate with the water group.
Right.
So then the next piece that we're going to get to, I'm not going to go through this table. It's just talking about the inflammatory markers. This becomes more interesting when we get to the graphs. But overall, what you're seeing, so the reactive oxygen species generated by the two different cells. So the immune cells, so those are the mononuclear cells, and then the polymorphonuclear cells. Basically, what you're seeing is the orange juice is the black triangle. We're gonna have lower ROS generation in general with the orange juice than we will with the glucose or the water. So the water had an initial spike, and then came back down to baseline at 5 hours. And then the OJ didn't spike as much as the water as far as ROS. And then at 3 hours is a little higher, but again, it came back down to baseline, whereas the glucose consistently remained elevated and they were statistically significant differences. And then then that was mononuclear cells. So it's like your white blood cells. And then for the polymorphonuclear cells, again, these are immune cells as well. The ROS generation changes. Again, the orange juice remains lower at 3 hours than the water and the glucose meal, and then was at 5 hours about the same spot as the glucose meal. And there, again, changes were significantly significant. So we're seeing, in general, lower reactive oxygen species from the orange juice meal than we are seeing from the water meal and the glucose meal. I'm sure you could drop these maybe even a little bit lower if you change some of the foods that were in there, but that's the whole point is just to see the difference. The next thing we're going to talk about here is the TLR2 and TLR4 expression. So TLR2 and TLR4 are inflammatory they're not mediators. They're signaling components. So the cells express these toll-like receptors, and they're usually associated with. They're supposed to. How do I want to put this? The toll-like receptors are sense if there's inflammation, tissue damage, viral infection, bacterial infection, or cellular debris, any of those types. So they're basically sensing receptors that pick up these different damages or insults to the body or to the cells. And they get upregulated and expressed when you have those occur. So TLR2 and TLR4, TLR4 specifically responds to endotoxin, and I think TLR2 responds to like tissue damage. So essentially what you're seeing is in the orange juice meal, the immune cells, the mononuclear cells, have significantly lower TLR2 and TLR4 expression than the water or the glucose group, and these are statistically significant at each point. So overall, we're having less TLR4 and TLR2. So the mRNA expression is essentially the signal from the nucleus to the ribosome to produce the protein. So the nucleus is signaling these less, but when we come down over here and we get to the protein, the actual production of protein of the TLR2 and TLR4 to produce the receptor, they're actually lower as well. So we're having less TLR2, less TLR4, which are receptors signaling some type of insult or inflammatory or infective response from the orange juice group compared to the water or the OJ meal. And then also the next piece here that's quite important is that we have significantly less endotoxin from the orange juice meal than we do from the water meal or the glucose meal. So overall, the orange juice seems to be manipulating the microbiome, or at least decreasing plasma endotoxin concentrations, and they're statistically significant at all time points. And then also decreasing inflammatory receptor signaling here with TLR2 and TLR4. It's decreasing the reactive oxygen species generation. And when we get back up to the top here, we have a decreased blood glucose spike and seems like an increased responsiveness to insulin overall. So the orange juice is having multiple beneficial effects here. So if you combine your orange juice with some coconut oil or olive oil in your meal, maybe have some eggs, cook them in coconut oil, and then you can have another fruit maybe and some hash browns on the side that are cooked in the coconut oil. Maybe put some olive oil on top when you're done. And then make sure you're not having any soy, and you have a recipe to alter your hormonal profile. And that's regardless of the calories and regardless of the macros per se. And that was the whole point of going through these studies in this episode, was to kind of dispel and show that there are other effects to these different foods besides just their calories or their macros.
Yeah, and to go back through a couple of the specifics, I think it's interesting to point out that, of course, yes, the orange juice with the meal reduced both TLR4 and TLR2 mRNA and protein expression, but the glucose group was the worst there, whereas the water group was in the middle. So what that tells us is that it probably isn't the glucose in the orange juice that's making a difference, but rather one of most likely two other factors. One, as you mentioned already, is fructose, which would have a blunting response on the insulin and glucose spikes. And also, we talked about in our fatty liver series, not only does it not cause fatty liver disease, but it very much supports liver function and supports the ability for the liver to detoxify. And so that could be a huge factor as far as the detoxification of endotoxin and other gut toxins go, and the reduction in inflammation that would also go along with that will lead to reduced TLR4 and TLR2 mRNA expression. But the other factor being the polyphenols in the orange juice that also could have a lot of those same effects: protective on the liver, reduction in maybe even the production of endotoxin in the first place, and a reduction in the inflammation response in general. So I don't think they did anything to delineate between those two things here, but I think both of those things are protective. And so when you're considering the application of this, it doesn't mean that orange juice is the only thing, but basically anything that contains fructose and polyphenols, to have it with your meal is probably pretty protective in general, especially if it's a worse meal, like the one that they had here. So that would mean basically, as you said, any fruit or fruit juice would, or honey or maple syrup, things like that would all.
They mentioned down low in discussion in the discussion about hesperetin and naringenin as possible mediators here. And they discuss that through, they're showing that, and let's see if I can find it. I forget where they discuss it, but they discuss the polyphenols as being possibly beneficial here, and that's being the reason that we have less negative effect from the orange juice. I have to look for where it is down at a different point, but they do mention those. And so yeah, the other thing is vitamins and minerals, right? The orange juice. If anybody doubts that orange juice is nutrient dense, because a lot of people say fruit is not, go on Chronometer whenever you get a chance, and that's the app that I think both of us recommend for clients to use, people to look at their food to see where they're at. Go on Chronometer and put in like 64 ounces or 32 ounces of orange juice and see where your vitamins and minerals are at. It's quite nutrient dense. I think you can cover all of your nutrients for the day, almost every single nutrient, with just orange juice. I think like 64 ounces of orange juice and 1 pound of steak. The only thing you'd be missing is some calcium. So if you wanted to throw in a little bit of dairy there, if you tolerate it, or supplement a little bit, you'd be fine. But you can, I think on Chronometer, you can cover all the daily targets with just those two foods, which is interesting overall.
Yeah. And they're using 75 grams of the amount of orange juice that would result in 75 grams of carbohydrates, which is not a small amount, probably 20 ounces or so. So, yeah. So, and you were right. They do mention that hesperetin and naringenin, the flavonoids that are present in orange juice, are likely responsible for the effect here. Of course, they can't say that the fructose was likely beneficial. That would be far too blasphemous for them to even consider that possibility. They do mention that flavonoids in general have been shown to reduce inflammation and have opposing effects on TLR4 and whatnot, but they said that generally it's in much higher levels than, much higher concentrations than would have been present in this study from this orange juice amount. So, yeah, I think the fructose could be a huge factor as well. Another thing, too, again, is pointing out that the orange juice, not only was it less than the pure glucose meal, but it was less than the water meal. So again, this is 75 grams of carbohydrates, half of which about are fructose, half are glucose, in addition to 80 grams of carbohydrates, which are probably all glucose from the muffin, and it's probably all from those muffins. So that's a meal that has 160 grams of almost 160 grams of carbohydrates, and that had less than the water meal, which had only 80 grams of carbohydrates. So less inflammation, less insulin and glucose response, and less TLR4 activity. All of these inflammatory markers. Right, there was less of an insulin and glucose response even compared to the water group too, right?
Yeah, the orange juice outperformed the water group as well. I'll scroll up here so you can see. Yeah, so the water was midway between, it had the lowest insulin response, but the blood sugar levels were actually higher. But the insulin response makes sense because you had more carbohydrate inside the orange juice group.
Yeah. So with 156 grams of carbohydrates versus 81 in the water group, 156 being in the orange juice group, you had less inflammation, lower blood sugar response, less oxidative damage, and all the markers that go with that, which of course jives perfectly with everything that we discuss in terms of the protective effects of carbohydrates and on from there, the protective effects of fructose. But from what you normally hear in the mainstream and the alternative, especially the low carb spheres, that is impossible, like so far from impossible, like so far beyond impossible. So yeah, I think that's, as you said, why this is a popular study in the bioenergetic community, is because it shows such a profound effect in that regard.
Yeah, and the other thing too is a lot of people say fructose increases endotoxin. Well, not in the orange juice study. And we've talked about reasoning why this is the case before. Because combining fructose with glucose, which orange juice does, allows it to be absorbed more easily. And then the polyphenols inside the juices and fruits and basically modulate the microbiome in a positive way and inhibit pathogenic species from basically capitalizing on the sugars. So the polyphenols have multiple beneficial effects. A lot of them are related to gut microbiome, but essentially the orange juice is protective against the damaging effects of some of these other crappy foods. Because it sounds like they went out and got everybody Mickey D's, right? It's an egg muffin sandwich with hash browns. It sounds like they got everyone Mickey D's and then they gave them orange juice, water, or a glucose drink, and called it a day. And that the OJ is about 22 ounces of orange, between 20 and 22 ounces of orange juice. You were right.
Yeah. So, and as we said, you're eating it in 15 minutes. Like you're eating this generally terrible food. It's not like this was organic, fresh squeezed orange juice. Not that it always has to be fresh squeezed or whatever, but yeah, I mean, and again, to tell someone that adding on top of your terrible meal, adding an extra, 37.5 grams of fructose from orange juice plus an extra 37.5 grams of glucose is going to reduce inflammation and reduce endotoxin and all of that. And as you said, some people will cite fructose increasing endotoxin. They definitely cite fructose increasing inflammation. They normally don't connect those dots with the endotoxin piece. We did that in our fatty liver series, but yeah, obviously having the fructose plus polyphenols in some combination, they're probably having we're seeing having a huge effect. So.
Yeah, all of it together. So if you ever read an article that says like juice is just as bad as soda, then just post this article in the comment section for everyone to see, because this is not reality. I think I discussed this study before, and the way I said comparing juice to soda or comparing juice to just like pure glucose is like comparing motorcycles and watermelons. Like they're completely different. Like it's an entirely different beast when you're looking at juice with the polyphenols, with the vitamins, with the minerals. And this study alone just trashes the if it fits your macro stuff. And it also trashes calories in, calories out to some extent, because technically the water group would have had the lower amount of calories, at least in a per meal setting, which, there's someone say, oh, well, over time. Well, in the per meal setting, we have decreased inflammation, decreased endotoxin, better insulin sensitivity just from adding in the orange juice, regardless of the fact that the total carbohydrates and the calories were pretty much the same. So.
Yeah, well, of course, you have to connect insulin. We need some other studies here, Mike, to connect insulin sensitivity and inflammation and endotoxin to weight gain or body fat gain, because there's no way those could have any effect. I mean, you didn't say calories. All those things aren't calories. I don't know how they could have any effect on body composition. Yeah,
we need randomized control trials and all of this stuff. So until then, we don't have any information, and we can't make any assumptions because it's not scientific.
Right. I do wish they had a sucrose group here to compare with the glucose and orange juice group. That would have been a good way to see how much of a role the polyphenols are playing. But
yeah, there's a lot more that could be. But overall, just based on today, we have avoid soy, avoid McDonald's, have your orange juice, and then use olive oil and coconut oil seem to be safe, especially if you're going to use an extra virgin, which would then also have polyphenols from the olive oil or the coconut oil. And then with the olive oil, certain varieties like Coratina are much lower in the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So there's options there as well. So those are just, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right, that's going to do it for today's episode. If you did enjoy it, please leave a like or comment if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening elsewhere, please leave a review or 5-star rating on iTunes. All of those things really do a lot to help support the podcast and are very much appreciated. To check out the show notes for today's episode, you can head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/podcast, where you can take a look at the studies and articles and anything else that we referenced throughout today's episode. And if you missed my announcement at the beginning of this episode, the brand new Energy Balance Solution group coaching program is up and running. And I'm really excited about this program. There are a ton of really great features included within it, and more than that, the results that people have been getting so far have just been incredible. So really excited about that. So let me tell you a little bit about what is included in the program. For one, you'll be getting 2 monthly small group coaching calls that allow you to get personalized help. And I keep these coaching calls again in small groups so that everyone has a chance to ask their questions and get the help that they need. Additionally, there is a video library that includes videos geared toward allowing you or helping you to implement the bioenergetic approach with clear action steps and tips This includes videos on how you can restore gut health, how you can lose weight without destroying your metabolism, how you can boost your metabolism, how you can have amazing restorative sleep, and tons more. And I'm continuing to add to this library every single month. And in addition to that video library, there are also resources like a sample meal plan, a food guide, a calorie and macronutrient cheat sheet, and more. And lastly, there is a private community where you can get support between those group coaching calls, both from me and also from everybody else in the program. So to find out more about that program, you can head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/solution. And with that, I'll see you in the next episode.